The black student married a 71-year-old billionaire. 7 days later, was shocked by what she saw. The morning light filters through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Manhattan penthouse as 25-year-old Zara Thompson sits in stunned silence, staring at documents that reveal her new husband's true intentions. Not the gold-digging scheme that gossip magazines assume, but a carefully orchestrated plan to transfer his $40 billion empire to someone whose character he'd observed for months before approaching her with a proposal that seemed impossible until love proved more powerful than logic. When loneliness meets authenticity across barriers that age creates, but that understanding can bridge. 7 days ago, she was a doctoral student in social work, struggling to afford textbooks, while serving meals at the charity kitchen where tech mogul Harrison Webb volunteers under assumed name. His disguise allowing him to find genuine connection that wealth had made impossible when everyone wanted his fortune, but no one wanted his heart, until meeting someone whose kindness couldn't be purchased, whose integrity couldn't be compromised, whose love couldn't be faked when honesty became foundation. For a relationship that society couldn't understand, but that hearts recognized as authentic when souls connect beyond circumstances that might separate, but that character unites. The Riverside Community Kitchen operates in converted warehouse, where Manhattan's forgotten gather for meals that dignity serves alongside nutrition. Its volunteers representing mixture of court-ordered community service and genuine compassion, while its guests range from temporarily displaced families to chronically homeless individuals whose stories reveal how quickly circumstances can change when illness, job loss, or family crisis transforms stability into survival mode that society prefers. Keeping invisible through comfortable distance that charity might bridge, but that understanding must span when humanity requires recognition rather than just service that obligation provides without genuine connection that healing demands. Zara's presence in kitchen reflects commitment born from personal experience rather than academic requirement. Her childhood memories of food insecurity driving dedication to ensuring others never face hunger alone when community support could provide dignity alongside sustenance. When service becomes expression of values rather than just requirement for degree completion that professional goals demand, but that personal mission transcends through understanding that textbooks teach, but that lived experience embeds in character that advantages cannot corrupt, when purpose guides behavior regardless of circumstances that might tempt compromise, but that integrity must resist. Harrison's disguise as Harry Webb allows him to escape identity that 40 years of business success has made impossible to separate from fortune that attract attention he no longer wants, admirers whose affection correlates with bank balance rather than personal character, relationships that dissolve when resources disappear, but that multiply when wealth accumulates through patterns that loneliness has taught him to recognize despite professional success that magazines celebrate, but that personal life has made meaningless when connection becomes impossible to distinguish from transaction, when money transforms every interaction into negotiation. Their first conversation happens over dishwater that wealth cannot make glamorous, but that service makes meaningful when shared purpose creates connection that circumstances cannot determine, when authentic interaction emerges naturally rather than requiring performance that social position typically demands. When personalities meet without barriers that assumptions create around age, race, or economic status, when genuine interest transcends superficial differences to discover compatibility that surprised both participants despite appearance of incompatibility that surface observation might suggest, but that deeper knowledge contradicts, when character reveals itself through consistent behavior rather than dramatic gestures. The relationship develops through months of weekly encounters that neither initially recognized as courtship. Their conversations ranging from social justice theory to personal philosophies, while hands work together preparing meals for people whose gratitude reminds both volunteers why service matters more than status, why contribution exceeds accumulation when measuring life's worth, why authentic connection transcends material circumstances when hearts recognize kindred spirits despite barriers that society creates around assumptions about compatibility that love must overcome when genuine affection develops naturally rather than requiring strategic planning that calculated relationships demand. Harrison's wealth remains secret that charity work helps maintain when designer clothes yield to kitchen uniforms. When private jets park unused while subway rides provide transportation that anonymity requires. When penthouse solitude gets traded for community kitchen fellowship that genuine purpose creates. When service becomes joy rather than obligation. When helping others helps heal loneliness that money cannot cure, but that authentic relationships might address through connections that transcend circumstances to discover humanity that privilege often obscures, but that humility can reveal when ego surrenders to empathy. The evening that transforms their friendship into something deeper happens after a particularly challenging day when kitchen serves record number of families displaced by apartment fire. Their immediate needs met through community response that Harrison coordinates with efficiency that business experience provides while Zara offers emotional support that social work training has taught, but that natural compassion makes authentic when crisis demands both practical assistance and human connection. That healing requires when trauma needs witnessing alongside aid that resources can provide, but that presence must deliver through understanding that suffering seeks more than solutions. Harrison's confession about his identity comes reluctantly, forced by media attention that threatens to expose his volunteer work unless he controls narrative that publicity creates when photographers discover billionaire serving soup rather than attending galas. When reporters investigate charitable activities, that humble participation makes newsworthy despite desire for privacy that wealth typically purchases, but that authentic engagement sometimes sacrifices when genuine involvement becomes visible to observation, that interest creates despite attempts at maintaining anonymity that service sometimes makes impossible. Zara, there's something I need to tell you about who I really am. Harrison begins, his words carrying vulnerability that decades of business negotiations never required when deals involve money rather than emotions, contracts rather than trust, professional relationships rather than personal connections, that honesty must foundation when deception becomes impossible to maintain without compromising integrity, that authenticity demands despite risks that revelation might create when truth threatens comfort that secrets provide, but that relationships cannot survive without transparency that love requires even when consequences seem frightening. The shock of learning that Harry Webb commands business empire worth more than most countries' GDP creates cognitive dissonance that Zara processes slowly, her understanding of their relationship requiring complete reconstruction when new information reveals motivations she never suspected. Generosity that seemed impressive from kitchen volunteer, but becomes staggering from billionaire whose charity could fund entire organizations rather than just individual meals, whose presence in kitchen represents choice rather than necessity, when alternatives include every luxury that money provides, but that loneliness makes meaningless without authentic connection. Her response demonstrates character that months of observation had revealed, but that crisis confirms when testing reveals true nature rather than performed personality. When pressure exposes authentic self rather than strategic presentation that calculated relationships require, when advantages create temptation for deception that integrity must resist if connection is to survive, revelation that changes everything while confirming nothing about essential character that consistent behavior had already demonstrated through actions that money cannot purchase or poverty can diminish, when values guide choices regardless of circumstances that might influence behavior but cannot corrupt principles that genuine character maintains. Harrison, Harry, whatever name you use, I care about the person who shows up here every week, who remembers everyone's story, who treats every guest with dignity regardless of their circumstances. Your money doesn't change who you are to me, though I understand if it changes everything else, Zara responds, her words carrying honesty that wealth cannot purchase, but that character provides freely when authenticity transcends circumstances to recognize humanity that circumstances cannot create or destroy, when essence remains constant despite external changes that revelation might require, but that core identity maintains through consistency that testing reveals rather than creates. The marriage proposal that follows seems impossible until love proves more logical than society's assumptions about appropriate partnerships, when connection transcends barriers that age, race, and economic differences create in minds trained to measure compatibility through superficial similarities rather than fundamental values, that character shares despite circumstances that might differ, but that principles unite when authentic relationship develops through understanding rather than assumption, through experience rather than expectation, through choice rather than convenience, when hearts recognize what minds might question, but that souls confirm through recognition that transcends rational analysis to embrace truth that love reveals. The ceremony itself deliberately avoids spectacle that wealth could create, taking place in same community center where they met rather than cathedral that money could rent, with guests including kitchen volunteers and frequent diners, rather than celebrities that invitation lists typically feature when status matters more than substance. When performance exceeds authenticity as priority for celebrations that society measures through expense rather than meaning, when genuine joy requires simplicity that complications cannot improve, but that pretension often corrupts through attempts at impressing observers rather than expressing authentic emotion that occasion demands. Media coverage alternates between fascination and condemnation as commentators struggle to process relationship that defies comfortable categories they use for understanding human connection. Their analysis ranging from gold-digging accusations to criticism about appropriate age differences, while missing entirely the genuine affection that sustained interaction had developed through shared service rather than strategic planning, through authentic compatibility rather than calculated advantage. When love emerges naturally despite obstacles that cynicism expects rather than barriers that understanding can overcome, through patience that commitment requires. Zara's family responds with mixture of concern and amazement as working-class background provides no framework for processing daughter's marriage to billionaire whose wealth exceeds anything their experience includes, their protective instincts warring with recognition that Zara's judgment has proven reliable throughout life choices, that wisdom guided rather than impulse determined. When careful consideration produces decisions that retrospective analysis validates despite initial appearance of questionable judgment, that time often corrects through results that vindicate choices which seem problematic until outcomes reveal wisdom that immediate evaluation might miss. Harrison's business associates struggle with cognitive dissonance created by marriage that challenges assumptions about appropriate partnerships for men whose wealth typically attracts younger women seeking financial security rather than older individuals seeking authentic connection. Their discomfort revealing prejudices about interracial relationships, combined with suspicions about motivations that genuine affection might inspire, but that cynical worldview cannot accept when experience has taught that money corrupts most relationships, while authentic love becomes impossible to identify when every interaction carries financial implications that sincerity cannot separate from strategy. The prenuptial agreement negotiations reveal Harrison's intentions that lawyers struggle to process when client insists on terms that protect Zara rather than preserve wealth. His instructions creating documents that transfer substantial assets immediately while ensuring security that normal divorce proceedings could not guarantee. His planning demonstrating commitment that temporary attraction cannot explain, but that deeper recognition requires when genuine partnership demands equality. That traditional arrangements between young wives and wealthy husbands typically prevent through power imbalances that money creates, but that love must overcome. The honeymoon period begins with adjustment challenges that fairy tales omit when reality requires navigating practical differences that romance cannot resolve automatically. When lifestyle changes demand adaptation from both partners despite love, that makes accommodation desirable, but does not make transition effortless when habits formed over decades must yield to consideration for spouse whose background differs dramatically, but whose values align sufficiently to make compromise worthwhile. Rather than sacrifice that resentment might create when authentic partnership requires mutual adjustment rather than one-sided submission. 7 days into marriage that skeptics predicted would last weeks. Zara discovers documents in Harrison's study that reveal planning extending months before their wedding. Detailed legal arrangements that transfer not just money, but complete control of business empire to woman he'd observed serving others without expectation of reward, whose character impressed him through consistency that performance cannot maintain when authentic behavior reveals genuine nature rather than strategic. Presentation that calculated relationships require when advantages create incentives for deception that integrity must resist despite temptations that circumstances provide. The shock comes not from discovering wealth. Harrison's identity had prepared her for financial implications, but from understanding scope of responsibility that marriage has created when document review reveals trusteeship of foundation, controlling billions dedicated to addressing systematic poverty, education inequality, and healthcare access in communities that traditional philanthropy often overlooks, when charity becomes tax deduction rather than genuine commitment to justice that effective. Change requires, through sustained attention rather than occasional gestures, that comfort provides without creating transformation that systematic problems demand. Her initial reaction combines panic with recognition of trust that responsibility represents. When someone whose life's work involves accumulating wealth chooses to transfer control to a person whose values he'd observed through months of volunteer service rather than years of business relationship, whose character he'd evaluated through consistent behavior rather than professional credentials, whose integrity he'd confirmed through interactions that money cannot influence when authentic. Personality emerges naturally rather than requiring performance that strategic thinking might demand, when calculated behavior seeks advantage rather than expressing genuine self. The foundation documents reveal extent of Harrison's research into her background, not invasive investigation that privacy violates, but careful observation of public behavior that character reveals through choices that consistency demonstrates, when principles guide actions regardless of audience that might influence performance but cannot corrupt authentic self, when genuine values determine behavior that testing confirms rather than creating through pressure that reveals existing character. Rather than manufacturing new personality that circumstances might require, but that integrity cannot sustain without authenticity that sustained observation validates. The realization that marriage represents not romantic impulsiveness, but calculated decision based on character assessment creates mixed emotions that gratitude and responsibility produce when trust exceeds expectations while demanding capabilities that preparation never provided. When confidence becomes burden that weight of billions creates despite good intentions that inexperience might corrupt through mistakes that knowledge could prevent, but that learning must develop through practice that guidance can support, but that individual judgment must ultimately provide when decisions affect millions of lives rather than just personal circumstances. Harrison's explanation, when confronted, combines vulnerability with strategic thinking that decades of business success have refined into ability to identify character through behavior that sustained observation reveals rather than first impression suggest. His confession describing loneliness that wealth had created through relationships that money complicated rather than enhanced. Connection that authenticity required, but that circumstances had made nearly impossible until kitchen service. Provided environment where genuine interaction could develop naturally rather than requiring negotiation that financial implications typically demand. The conversation that follows transforms marriage from romantic experiment into conscious partnership dedicated to addressing systematic problems that individual wealth cannot solve, but that coordinated effort might impact when resources serve justice rather than just accumulating advantage, when privilege becomes tool for creating opportunity rather than just enjoying comfort, When power serves transformation rather than just maintaining status quo, that inequality perpetuates through systems. That reform must challenge if change is to benefit everyone rather than just those whose circumstances already provide security that others lack through barriers that systematic intervention could eliminate. Harrison's health diagnosis: pancreatic cancer that aggressive treatment might delay but cannot cure, explains urgency behind marriage timing that romantic impatience seemed to motivate, but that medical reality actually demanded when limited time requires decisive action rather than extended courtship, that luxury cannot afford when mortality creates deadlines that healthy individuals never face. When legacy becomes immediate concern rather than distant consideration that retirement might address. When time permits careful planning that crisis eliminates through pressure that forces choices which comfort might defer but that necessity demands. The revelation transforms Zara's understanding of their relationship from improbable romance into deliberate succession planning that business wisdom guides when personal preference aligns with practical necessity. When character assessment indicates capability that formal training might not provide, but that observed behavior suggests through consistency that testing confirms rather than creating, when genuine nature emerges through sustained interaction rather than requiring pressure to reveal. Authentic self that performance cannot maintain, when authenticity demands honesty that circumstances might challenge, but cannot corrupt, when integrity provides foundation that external forces cannot shake. Her response demonstrates maturity that age cannot guarantee, but that experience develops, when challenges require growth rather than just endurance, when responsibility demands capability rather than just good intentions, when trust requires wisdom rather than just loyalty, when burden of billions creates obligations that preparation never anticipated, but that character must meet through decisions that experience cannot fully prepare for, but that principles must guide when ethical frameworks provide direction that specific training might not offer, but that values create through understanding that purpose transcends personal comfort to serve missions that humanity requires. The Foundation's current projects reveal scope of systematic change that coordinated wealth can support when resources serve transformation rather than just maintaining comfortable arrangements that benefit some while disadvantaging others, when investment creates opportunity rather than just accumulating returns, when philanthropy addresses causes rather than just treating symptoms, that systematic problems create through patterns that individual effort cannot overcome, but that collective action might address, when sustained commitment meets strategic thinking to produce results that intentions alone cannot achieve, without effectiveness that measurement must guide. The transition period that follows combines intensive education about foundation operations with emotional processing of relationship that defies every category that society uses for understanding human connection. When genuine affection must navigate practical responsibilities that love makes worthwhile, but does not make simple. When authentic partnership requires accommodation from both parties despite differences that understanding can bridge, but that adjustment must address through patience. That commitment provides when obstacles cannot discourage dedication, that purpose makes meaningful rather than burdensome. 6 months later, Harrison's condition deteriorates with speed that medical treatment cannot prevent despite resources that provide every possible intervention. His final weeks spent transferring not just legal control, but practical wisdom about stewarding wealth responsibly, when billions can create positive change or devastating damage, depending on decisions that character must guide, when good intentions require competence that experience develops through mentorship that time constraints limit. But that intensity can compensate when necessity accelerates learning, that normal circumstances would pace more gradually, but that crisis makes urgent. Zara's transformation from doctoral student to foundation president demonstrates capability that observation had suggested, but that responsibility confirms when testing reveals authentic leadership that formal training might not provide, but that character creates through decisions that pressure reveals rather than generates, when principles guide choices despite obstacles that might discourage those whose commitment depends on Comfort rather than conviction when purpose transcends personal. Preference to serve missions that difficulty cannot diminish when dedication makes sacrifice meaningful rather than painful through understanding that service requires giving beyond what receiving provides. The media narrative shifts from skepticism about motives to recognition of genuine partnership that produces results which cynicism cannot explain, but that authentic collaboration achieves when resources serve wisdom rather than just accumulating power. When wealth becomes tool for justice rather than just enjoying luxury. When success measures impact rather than just influence. When effectiveness matters more than image. Transformation more than just maintaining arrangements that's systematic. Reform must challenge if institutions are to serve everyone rather than just those whose approval feels comfortable when prejudice meets principle. Harrison's death creates grief that preparation cannot ease despite knowledge that time was limited. Loss that planning cannot prevent despite legal arrangements that secure foundation's future. Emptiness that legacy cannot fill despite knowing that life's work continues through marriage that began as impossible romance but became essential partnership when love proved stronger than logic, connection deeper than calculation, authenticity more powerful than assumption when hearts recognize what minds might question, but that souls confirm through recognition that transcends rational analysis. The funeral becomes celebration of life that exemplified transformation possible when wealth serves wisdom rather than just accumulating advantage, when privilege creates opportunity rather than just enjoying comfort, when power serves justice rather than just maintaining status quo, when legacy measures contribution rather than just accumulation, impact rather than just influence, love rather than just longevity, when authentic relationships transcend circumstances that might separate, but that character unites through connections that death cannot destroy, when genuine partnership creates bonds that time cannot break despite physical absence that grief must process. The foundation under Zara's leadership expands impact through approaches that combine social work training with business resources, her background providing insights that traditional philanthropy often lacks, when charity maintains distance rather than creating connection, when aid provides assistance rather than addressing causes, when help preserves systems rather than transforming them through changes that effectiveness requires, when systematic problems demand systematic solutions that individual effort cannot achieve alone, but that coordinated action can produce, when preparation meets opportunity through circumstances that make transformation possible. The Black student who married billionaire becomes woman whose leadership transforms how wealth serves justice, whose partnership transcended barriers that society creates around assumptions about compatibility, whose love proved authentic despite skepticism that appearances generated, but that results vindicated when authentic connection revealed itself through consistency that performance cannot maintain, when genuine relationships develop through understanding rather than assumption, through choice rather than convenience, when souls recognize compatibility that circumstances might obscure, but that character reveals through behavior that time confirms rather than creating, when authenticity transcends superficial differences to discover fundamental similarities that hearts recognize, when minds remain open to possibilities that prejudice might deny, but that experience can confirm, when love chooses connection over separation. If this story moved you, maybe it's time to examine your own assumptions about who belongs together, what makes relationships authentic, and how love can transcend barriers that society creates around age, race, and economic status, when character matters more than circumstances, when genuine connection emerges through shared values rather than superficial similarities, when authentic partnership serves purposes greater than personal comfort, but creates meaning that comfort alone cannot provide. If it is, choose authenticity over assumption, character over circumstances, love over logic, when hearts recognize truth that minds might question, but that souls confirm through connections that transcend barriers to discover humanity that unites rather than differences that divide.